Hello everyone, Lloyd Rieber here with my next Q workshop video. In this video, I will focus exclusively on an introduction to analyzing Q data with Shawn Banasick's free KenQ software. I'll be using the desktop version called KADE. I suggest you watch this video twice. First, just sit back and take it all in. I even suggest avoiding the temptation to take notes. Then, watch it a second time with my handy-dandy KADE cheat sheet at your side to begin to understand the flow of the many steps involved. Fortunately, I think you'll find KADE to be very easy to follow and even pretty intuitive. That said, if you are new to factor analysis, then realize that many of the steps may seem downright mysterious. So for now, just rely on the advice and guidance I provided in my cheat sheet, and all of the mysteries will reveal themselves in due time as you read and study the Q literature. With that in mind, I'm going to resist the temptation to do any kind of full explanation of the various steps. Now just isn't the time. So think of this video more as a nice initial overview of the analysis process and not a tutorial. Okay, let's begin. Well, obviously the first step to do is to launch the KADE software. And when you do, you'll see here on the left-hand side, there is a nice step-by-step menu of the steps we're going to follow. So let's start with step number one, input. And you'll see here that there are a variety of ways to bring data into KADE. So the first Q sort that we did in the workshop was on paper. And so I found that the best way to do that is to use one of two templates that Shawn Banasick provides with his software itself. And these templates are done in Excel. And I'll just bring up an example of what that looks like. So here is the Excel spreadsheet. And this is something that Shawn makes freely available. And you can see down below that there are these tabs to the various sheets. Now, as it turns out, tab 1 is just a guide. You can look that over. And tabs 4 and 5 are examples. Okay. Now, the two tabs you need to fill in would be sorts and statements. So I'll go to statements first. In the very first Q sort, on food preferences, here they are. Here are all the food types that I included in that particular Q sort. So you just list those out there, and again, no matter how many statements you have. And if they are statements, of course, it'd be one statement per cell. Then sorts, and I'll focus down here that you have to provide the data, and as you can see, you're going to have your sort grid being identified here. So depending on what your sort grid looks like, you have to be very careful that it matches up. But you can see the point. You have the people in each of the different columns as you go across, and their data would be in all of the different rows. So that would have to be entered manually. And at the top of this sheet, you can see that this is where you tell the KADE software, what does my grid look like? In this case, I have two rows in the column -4 and 2 in +4. So you'll see that symmetry here, but you have to get this exactly right. Then you would save it, and you can bring that into KADE. And in KADE, I would simply click on the Excel tab there, and I would choose the correct choice depending on which Excel file I actually use. So type 1, type 2, what I just showed you was type 1. Type 2 is very similar, but the data is just entered a little bit differently depending on which one you prefer. But the method I want to bring in my data from our second Q sort on educational preferences or preferences for doing educational research is going to be the PQ method format. And for this, I need to have a statements file and a data file. So how can I get that data? Well, I used my app to do this particular Q sort, and fortunately, my app will export both of those files. So that's what I'm going to do first. All right, I'm going to bring up my app, and this is the instructor version of the app. and I will make this freely available to anyone who wants it. And you'll see that in my instructor version, I do have this instructor mode. So I'll click that to turn it on. And this gives me the opportunity now to simply analyze a Q sort without me having actually done the Q sort. Click on that. What is the code? And I'll enter the code that I used most recently. And here we go. Here are the 12 people who completed that particular Q sort. And there's a name key. I won't click on that if I want to see the actual name. What I'm seeing here is the alias that each of the individuals put into the software when they did the Q sort. But you see down here, export data in PQ method format. So that's what I'm going to choose now. And you can see I have these 3 windows of different kinds of data. So the actual data file that KenQ needs is right here, and I have a choice of either copying that to the clipboard or saving it as a file on my computer. So I'm going to click to save the file, and I made a folder already, and it's already pointing to that folder where I want to save the data. And I also need to save the statements as a STA file, and again, I'm going to save those to that location. And my software, if you choose to, can also collect survey data. In this particular case, I did not collect that data. Okay, I now can go back to KenQ and import that data. All right, I'll just click on the KenQ window there, the KADE window. And now I'll go ahead and load both of those files. So I'll start with the statements file. And it's already pointing to the correct folder, luckily. So I'll just open or double click on the statements file. I'll do the same thing now for the data file. And here it comes. All right, so it's that easy. So exporting the data from my app and then importing it into KADE. And now let's take a look at the data, step number 2. And this is just a place where you can actually go and take a look at the data. So there's nothing to do here other than to view the data, make sure everything looks okay. All right, well, now we're just going to go ahead and follow these steps in order. Let's go then to step number 3, correlations. And all I have to do here is click one button, calculate the correlations. And we'll talk a lot more about correlations and kind of what the whole concept is, but most people understand it's about relationships, and it goes from -1 to 1. If your Q sort and my Q sort were exactly the same, then we would have a perfect correlation of 1. If I gave Brussels sprouts a +4 and you gave Brussels sprouts a -4, and it was exactly that reverse pattern all the way through the Q sort, then it would also be a perfect correlation, but a negative correlation. What I love, you hate. Of course, it's rare, if ever. I've never seen 2 Q sorts that are exactly the same. So you're going to be somewhere in the middle between -1 and +1. But again, all I did was calculate the correlations. I see them. I can review this if I want to, but I'm going to move on to step number 4, factors. And now here is where some of the mystery begins to come into this. So I'm looking at my cheat sheet. I'm now on step number 4 that says click on number 4, factors. And we're going to simply use the advice here of clicking on something called principal components. And when I do so, I get this very interesting and probably to most of you confusing table. But what I am going to focus our attention on is down here, this thing called eigenvalues. As I go through here, I see there are 8 factors, but you might notice how those eigenvalues, it starts off very high, 6.5604, then it starts to drop off very quickly. So we need to choose the number of factors that we want to have in our analysis. How to choose? Well, as the handout, the cheat sheet indicates, we're going to use a very general rule at the very beginning where we're going to use all the factors that have these eigenvalues greater than 1. So in this case, it would only be factor 1 and factor 2. And it's also good to kind of scroll down a little bit. You'll see this thing called a scree plot, and it's a visual of the very same numbers. So if you take a look up here, I think I can get both in the same window. Factor 1, 6.56. You can see that's exactly where that is plotted. Factor 2, 1.49. That's exactly where that dot is plotted. And this is meant to be a visual way of making a decision as well. And it comes from the analogy of a mountainside that has some falling rocks. You know, at the base of a mountain, you're going to have lots of rocks that have fallen off, the different debris. And the question is, where does that, well, and that debris is called scree. Where does that scree or debris start? In other words, what is still attached to the mountain and what is not attached? And so the idea is that 1 and 2 clearly are part of the mountain here, but you can see how it kind of falls off. So this seems to be an inflection point. So a lot of ways of doing this. Those are the two main ways you'll see in the literature. Choose eigen values that is at least 1 or above. Now, that is a rule of thumb. That is not a law, but it's a very good starting point. All right, so with that in mind, I'm going to go now to step 5, rotation, which is, again, rather a mysterious thing. And I'm going to choose 2 factors based on what I decided in step number 4 to rotate. So let me submit. And what is rotation? Well, again, I'm not going to go into a full explanation. The best little analogy that the book uses is that our data now is kind of blurry, all right? We need to bring it into focus in order to understand what is really going on. And that's what rotation is. You can kind of imagine rotating the lens of a camera to bring something into focus. So I'm going to choose 2. Make sure you click submit button. Oftentimes I forget to do that. And then we're going to choose something called Varimax. And I'm just going to click the button to do it. All right, Varimax applied. Now we go to step number 6, loadings. And you can see I only have the 2 factors here. So, and you can kind of see there's a gray area and a white area. I'm going to choose, though, to highlight with color. I really like this in KADE, how it gives me this option of colors. And then I'm going to choose the auto flag at a probability level of less than 0.05. Very, very standard. And you can see now which people's Q sorts are associated mostly with factor 1 and which people's Q sorts are mostly associated with factor 2. So you see these numbers, these are loadings, and you can see how this one, and these also go from -1 to +1. So 0.8087, and on factor 2, -0.23, so a much smaller number. But you'll notice as I go down, Megan here, this number 0.658, it's bigger than this number, but the difference is not nearly as pronounced. So in many ways, Shin's Q sort is the closest representation to what's going on in factor 1. But all of these people contribute to factor 1, as all of these people here, their Q sorts, I should say, contribute to factor 1. All right, so that's good. I can now send that table data to the next stage. The only thing I want to bring up at this point is, if I really like KenQ as a sandbox for exploring, you might say, well, what would a 3-factor solution look like? Well, I can just go back to factors, reset the analysis, and try again. Let me start over with principal components. And I get the same data, but now I'll go to rotation, and I'll choose 3 instead of 2. And then I'll choose Varimax again, go down to loadings, colors, and auto flag. So you can see here, again, that in this case, no one is loading onto factor 3, and I've now kind of muddied the waters a little bit with factors 1 and 2. But this is what I like about KenQ. You can go ahead and play around with the data, and a lot of the decisions you make with factor analysis are not necessarily going to be straightforward. And you'll read in the Q literature about the need for the Q researcher to be using abductive logic and reasoning in a very qualitative way to make some of these decisions here in factor analysis. So let me go back to factors, reset, and I'm pretty confident that a rotation using just 2 factors is the way to go. So I'm clicking buttons pretty quickly now. I click 2, then submit, then go to Varimax, click Varimax rotation. Then back to loadings, and again I'll do color, auto flag, and there we have our what I think is probably the best solution. All right, so now I'm going to move on to step number 7, but I have to remember to send this table data to the output. So this is sort of like an intermediate step, maybe step 6.5. All right, there it goes. Now I'll go to output. Okay, well, I really like KenQ for what it provides the researcher in terms of output. So I'll show you the basics of it here. There's a lot that it does provide. But first of all, I need to select which factors I want to show in the output. Well, I do want all of them, and typically that's always what you're going to choose. So click all, make sure they're lit up, and then hit submit. And right away, it gives me the opportunity to download the complete output as an Excel file. And I'll go ahead and do that. And I'll save it to the very same folder. And we'll explore that in just a little bit. But what I want to explore now are the factor visualizations. This is a wonderful part of the KADE software. So I'm going to go to factor visualizations, and I'll say display the composite factors. And the composite factors are best thought of as a weighted average of all the Q sorts of the people in that particular factor. So remember that little number that I was pointing out that was very strong or was particularly high for the first person, and it decreased as it went down. So consider that as the weight that's going to be given to each of the Q sorts that then get averaged in this particular visual here. So this is like the group's Q sort for factor 1, and helps us to interpret what is going on, how to interpret that particular factor. And here's the one for factor 2. But I can change the visual characteristics quite nicely. And here's what I always like to do. I'll go up to View Display Options, and I always like to include the statement number. So I'll add that. And then I think it's kind of nice to use color in order to show these distinguishing statements and the consensus statements. So let me turn those options on and then choose to update the factor visualizations. Yeah, so you can see now that we have the blue and gray, and just as it says, the blue are considered consensus statements, meaning both groups kind of share a very same viewpoint associated with those statements, whereas the gray are statements are ways to distinguish or to compare and contrast what is different between the two factors. And I like how I can just download each one of these as a separate PNG file, and I will do that, making sure I'm saving it into the correct folder. That's for factor 1, and a PNG for the composite Q sort for factor 2. Download as a PNG. Okay, now what you will also want to have as part of your output is something called a factor array, and in a table format. As it turns out, what you're looking at right now for factor 1, and then as I scroll down to factor 2, if I look at both of those visuals at the same time and compare them, a factor array is the very same data that are represented here in these two visuals. But it's really hard to do that, and a table might be a better way of doing it. So how do we make a factor array? Well, it turns out that is included in the Excel file that we downloaded a little bit ago. So let me go ahead and launch that Excel file. Okay, let me show the folder that's been on my desktop. There it is. And there's all the different files that I've been saving as I have been doing this little demonstration. But there is the Excel file that KADE made. Let me launch that and try to put it in the window so you can see it. Okay, there we go. And yeah, so you can see here at the bottom, there's all these tabs, and there's a lot of them. I can just start going from left to right. So many. So there's just a lot of data, and I encourage you to explore this a lot as the weeks unfold. But what I want to do is go till I find one called consensus disagreement. Aha, there it is. So this is the factor array, and as you can see, all of the statements are here, but they're not in chronological order. It's 20, then 38, then 1. Instead, they're in an order of something called z-score variance. So in a way, what you're seeing is the statements, the consensus statements are going to be toward the top, and all of the distinguishing statements are going to be toward the bottom. So as I'm looking here, you can see that the statement data collected in words and numbers can complement one another. There was relative agreement between the two groups. One group gave it a +2, one group gave it a +3. But if I look at the bottom, I see that I like working with words. There was some disagreement. Group 1 gave that a -1, whereas Group 2 gave it a +3. So this is going to be very helpful. Now, sometimes you might find it's better to put the factor array actually in the order of the statements, 1 all the way down to whatever the last statement would be. So how would I do that? Well, it's Excel. I can simply reorder this information. I'm a person who doesn't like to mess with the original data, so I'm going to use the option in Excel to make a copy of this particular sheet. I'm going to put it after this consensus disagreement, but I have to, you'll see in a second, I have to actually choose where to put it in front of. So factor characteristics is where I will put it in front of. So if I just right click on consensus disagreement tab, I can choose to move for copy. I'm going to choose to create a copy. And as I just said, I got to find the one after it to move it before that one. All right, good. So you can see consensus disagreement 2. Here's the original. No, they're exactly the same now, but I'm going to go to the second one, and I'm going to choose to highlight all of these particular rows that have the data. And you'll notice that there is a header row in row 4, and that'll be important for me to either note that I have one or I don't have one. So when I go up to data now, which I realize you can't see, I'll go to this data. Okay, that's fine. I can choose this approach, sort. Yeah, so what column am I going to choose? Well, it's the column you can see over here with NM in it, because I have this chosen my list has headers. If you don't have headers, you would turn that off and just choose column A, I guess. Yeah, so click OK. And there we have it. We have now the very same data, but now in order of the statements. And this is typically how you will see them. I shouldn't say that. I think you might see factor arrays in published reports, either with the statement organized or sorted like this, or by the z-score variance. Okay, so there you have it. Okay, I think this is a good place to end the video. I'll just go back to the KADE software before I do so. And yeah, obviously the next thing you need to do, as I say, maybe watch this video again and use my cheat sheet to help to make some sense of the various steps. But at the very beginning, you're just going to have to trust some of the advice that is given. But the best way to learn this, of course, is to do it and to get your own data and to begin to explore the analysis, the quantitative analysis. And the interpretation of the different factors, of course, is going to be a very important part. There's definitely a qualitative aspect to it based on interviews or surveys that you might be conducting with the people as they finish the Q sorts, or maybe as they're doing the Q sorts. But the software, the quantitative side, also provides, as you can see, through the composite Q sorts and the factor array, a great deal of data that will help in the interpretation also. Okay, until next time.